Hey everyone, and welcome. So, if you're just starting out in environmental science, you've almost definitely heard this word biosphere pop up. And yeah, it sounds huge, right? Maybe a little overwhelming. But don't worry, today we're going to break it all down into simple, easy to understand parts. Let's start with the really big picture, and then we'll zoom right in. So, let's just start with a really basic question. What makes our planet, Earth, so alive? I mean, when you look at all the other planets in our solar system, what's the one thing that really makes us stand out? The answer, of course, is life. And all that life, every single bit of it, is packed into a surprisingly specific area. And that area, that's what we call the biosphere. It's basically the sum of all the parts of Earth where life exists. We're talking everything from the tiniest microbes buried deep in the ground to birds soaring way up in the atmosphere. The analogy here is perfect. Think of the biosphere like the skin on an apple. It's this super thin, really fragile layer compared to the whole planet, but that thin layer is where all the magic happens. Okay, so how do we even begin to understand something so massive? Well, you can't just look at the whole thing at once, right? That's where the science of ecology comes in. Ecology is all about studying how living things interact with each other and their environment. And it gives us a really neat framework, kind of like a set of building blocks. We're going to start with the smallest block and build our way up to see how it all fits together. And here they are. These are the 4 key levels we're going to walk through. We'll start with a single organism, then we'll see what happens when you group them together into a population. After that, we'll look at how different populations form a community. And finally, we'll see how that community and its physical surroundings make up an ecosystem. So let's dive in at the ground floor, the organism. All right, so everything starts with one single living thing, an organism. You know, that could be a person like you, a tree outside your window, a goldfish, or even a single tiny bacterium. But even at this most basic level, life isn't all the same. There are some really big, fundamental differences in how organisms are built. One of the biggest divides in all of biology comes down to their cells. All living things fall into one of 2 camps. First, you've got prokaryotes. Think bacteria. They're pretty simple. Their DNA just kind of floats around freely inside the cell. Then you have eukaryotes. That's us and plants and animals. Our cells are more complex. They have a nucleus, which is basically like a tiny safe that holds and protects all our DNA. And trust me, that one little difference, having a nucleus or not, is a huge deal in the story of life. Okay, another super important difference is how living things get their fuel, their energy. You have the autotrophs, which literally means self-feeders. These are the amazing ones, like plants that can make their own food from scratch using sunlight. Then there's everybody else. We're the heterotrophs, or other feeders. We can't make our own food, so we have to eat other organisms to get energy. And right there, you've got the absolute foundation of every food chain on the planet. So organisms don't usually live all by themselves, right? They group up. And that's our next level. When you get a bunch of the same species living in the same area, let's say all the gray squirrels in a city park, that's a population. Simple enough. Now let's zoom out. In that same park, you also have populations of pigeons, oak trees, maybe some ants. All of those different populations living and interacting together, that's what we call a community. All right, we've got our building blocks, organisms, populations, communities. Now let's see how they all click together to create a working system. We're moving up to the ecosystem level now, and we're going to focus on 2 really crucial ideas: how energy moves through the system and how that system deals with big changes. So what exactly is an ecosystem? It's pretty simple, really. It's the community, so all the living or biotic things, plus their non-living or abiotic surroundings. So it's not just the squirrels and the trees anymore. Now we're also including the sunlight, the rain, the dirt, the temperature, all of it. And what's cool is that an ecosystem can be tiny, like a little puddle, or absolutely massive, like the entire Amazon rainforest. And this is how that energy we talked about actually moves. It's a food chain. It all starts with the producers, the plants soaking up sunlight. Then along come the primary consumers, the herbivores, who eat the plants. Next up are the secondary consumers, the carnivores, who eat the herbivores. And then, when any of these things die, the cleanup crew arrives, the decomposers. They break everything down and send the nutrients back into the system to be used all over again. This quote really nails it. When something gets eaten, the energy that was stored in its body, what scientists call its biomass, gets passed up to the next level. It's a transfer of energy. But, and this is probably the single most important thing to remember about food chains,
that transfer is not very good. In fact, it's really, really inefficient.
How inefficient? We're talking only about 10%. That's it. Only 10% of the energy from one level actually makes it into the body of the next level. So where does the other 90% go? Well, it's mostly lost as heat, while the organism is just, living its life, moving around, breathing, keeping warm. This is called the 10% rule, and it changes everything about how an ecosystem is structured.
And that 10% rule is exactly why we get this pyramid shape. Think about it. If the plants at the bottom have 100% of the energy, the herbivores that eat them only get 10% of that. And the carnivores that eat them, they only get 1% of the original energy. This is why you have way more grass than you have zebras, and way more zebras than you have lions. There just isn't enough energy to support a huge population at the top of the food chain. But, ecosystems aren't these perfectly stable things that last forever. They get hit by disasters. So what happens when something huge comes along and just wipes the slate clean, like a massive forest fire or a volcanic eruption? How does life come back from that? Well, there's a name for that recovery process. It's called ecological succession. And there are two main flavors of this. You've got primary succession. This is starting from absolute scratch. We're talking bare rock, like after a volcano cools. Life has never been there before. It's a super slow process because you have to build soil from nothing, and that can take thousands of years. Then you have secondary succession. This is what happens after, say, a fire. The old community is gone, but, and this is the key, the soil is still there. Because you have that foundation, things can grow back way, way faster, maybe in just a few hundred years. So if you remember one thing, remember this. It's all about the soil. So succession describes how communities change over, hundreds of years. But what about changes on a much, much grander timescale? Like, what happens when the whole climate changes over thousands or even millions of years? For life to survive that, the species themselves have to change. This really slow, gradual adaptation is what we call evolution. And it's important to remember, this isn't about one animal changing in its lifetime. It's about the DNA of an entire population slowly shifting over many, many generations. And this process leads to two main survival strategies. On one hand, you have specialists. Think of a panda. It's become an expert at one thing, eating bamboo. As long as there's plenty of bamboo, it's golden. But if something happens to the bamboo forests, the panda is in big trouble. On the other hand, you have generalists. The classic example is a cockroach. It can live pretty much anywhere and eat pretty much anything. It's not the best at any one thing, but because it's so flexible, it's incredibly adaptable when things change. Whew, okay, that was a lot, I know. We've gone all the way from single cells to the entire planet. So let's wrap this up with a quick recap. Think of this as your cheat sheet, the absolute essential concepts you'll want to have locked down for your classes, for a test, or just to really understand the stuff. All right, let's run through it. First, the biosphere is that super thin, living layer on Earth, the skin of the apple. Second, ecology is organized into levels. You start with an organism, which forms a population, then a community, and finally an ecosystem. Third, remember the 10% rule. Energy flows up the food chain, but it's really inefficient. Fourth, ecosystems aren't static, they bounce back from disaster through succession. And last but not least, species adapt to long-term change through evolution, becoming either piggy specialists or flexible generalists. Which brings us to one last really big question to leave you with. You can make a very strong case that humans are the ultimate generalist species. We've learned to survive in almost every environment on Earth. So now that we understand a little more about how these delicate systems work, what does our incredible success mean for the future of that thin, fragile biosphere? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me.